Long before missiles, sanctions, or nuclear negotiations, the tension between the United States and Iran was shaped by a single lesson both sides learned early. Power in the Middle East is never just about territory, it is about influence, survival, and memory. In the early Cold War years, Iran sat on a geopolitical fault line. It bordered the Soviet Union, possessed vast oil reserves, and controlled access routes between Asia, Europe, and the Persian Gulf. For Washington, Iran was not just another country, it was a strategic pillar in the containment of Soviet expansion. Stability in Tehran meant stability in global energy supply and a barrier against Moscow's reach. But stability came at a price. In 1953, Iran's elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, moved to nationalize the country's oil industry, which had long been dominated by British interests. To many Iranians, this was economic independence. To London and Washington, it looked like a dangerous shift that could open the door to Soviet influence. A covert operation helped remove Mossadegh and strengthen the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The Shah modernized the country rapidly, built a powerful security state, and aligned closely with the West. From an American strategic viewpoint, Iran became a success story, pro-Western, militarily strong, and a guardian of Gulf oil routes. From the perspective of many inside Iran, however, the monarchy symbolized foreign interference and repression backed by outside power. This dual reality planted a deep mistrust that would later define everything. By the late 1970s, social unrest, economic inequality, and political suppression converged. In 1979, the Islamic Revolution toppled the Shah and brought a new leadership to power, one that built its legitimacy around rejecting Western dominance. The revolution was not only political, it was ideological. The United States was no longer seen as a distant superpower, but as the former patron of a system many Iranians blame for decades of injustice. The takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and the hostage crisis locked this hostility into place. For Americans, it was a national humiliation broadcast daily on television. For the new Iranian leadership, it was proof that they could stand up to a superpower. Trust collapsed entirely. Formal diplomatic ties ended. A relationship once defined by alliance transformed into enduring confrontation. During the 1980s, this rivalry did not erupt into direct war, but unfolded through layered conflict. The Iran-Iraq War consumed the region for 8 brutal years. The United States, concerned about revolutionary Iran spreading influence, tilted toward Iraq. Skirmishes occurred in the Persian Gulf, including attacks on shipping and naval clashes. Each encounter reinforced the perception on both sides that the other was fundamentally hostile. After the war, Iran faced isolation and sanctions, but adapted. Rather than competing head-to-head with U.S. conventional military power, it invested in alternative tools, missile programs, regional partnerships, and non-state allies. This approach allowed Tehran to extend its reach without matching American air power or naval dominance. Influence could be projected indirectly, through political leverage and armed groups across the region. Meanwhile, the United States expanded its presence in the Gulf, deepening ties with Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other states wary of Iran's revolutionary message. Military bases, defense agreements, and naval patrols became routine. Each side framed its actions as defensive. Each saw the other's moves as encirclement. The 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq reshaped the balance in unexpected ways. Removing Saddam Hussein eliminated one of Iran's primary regional adversaries. Iraq's new political order opened space for parties and militias with ties to Tehran. From Washington's viewpoint, The intervention aimed to reshape the region and remove a threat. From Tehran's perspective, it was proof that the U.S. was willing to use overwhelming force to redesign governments, a scenario Iranian leaders were determined to prevent from happening at home. As years passed, the nuclear issue moved to the center of international attention. Iran insisted its program was peaceful. The United States and its allies feared it could shorten the path to a weapon. Sanctions intensified, targeting oil exports, banking, and trade. The pressure damaged Iran's economy but did not eliminate its strategic ambitions. Instead, it reinforced a doctrine of resilience. Survive under pressure, wait out adversaries, and avoid giving a clear pretext for direct war. At the same time, conflicts in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq became arenas of indirect competition. Support for allied groups allowed Iran to challenge U.S. influence and that of its regional partners without open confrontation. For Washington, these networks represented destabilizing forces. For Tehran, they were deterrence, a way to ensure that any attack on Iran itself would have consequences across multiple fronts. Attempts at diplomacy periodically eased tension. Agreements slowed parts of Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. But these arrangements were fragile, vulnerable to political change in Washington or Tehran. When trust is already minimal, every violation or withdrawal confirms worse suspicions. By the late 2000s, the situation resembled a cold conflict with hot edges. Sanctions tightened again. Military incidents in the Gulf increased. Strikes, cyber operations, and proxy clashes formed a constant background of risk. Both governments publicly avoided calls for full-scale war, aware of the costs, yet continued policies that raised the temperature. This long history matters because it shapes how any future strike would be understood. A limited military action might be framed by one side as precise deterrence, but the other side would see it through decades of intervention, pressure, and rivalry. Decisions would not be judged in isolation. They would be interpreted as part of a continuous pattern stretching back generations. By the time modern tensions reach the brink, neither Washington nor Tehran is reacting only to the present moment. Each is responding to a layered past. Coups, revolutions, wars, sanctions, and standoffs that turned a former partnership into one of the most consequential rivalries in the world. When force enters that equation, it does not land on neutral ground. It lands on history already charged, where every action risks unlocking reactions far beyond the original intent. A direct U.S. strike on Iranian territory would not unfold like the wars of the past, with mass troop buildups and weeks of public warning. It would begin suddenly, shaped by intelligence assessments, political calculations, and the desire to act fast enough to surprise, but limited enough to avoid full-scale invasion. The objective would be clear: impose a cost, degrade specific capabilities, and signal that certain lines cannot be crossed. The trigger could stem from several developments converging at once. Evidence that Iran is close to weapons-grade nuclear capability, a deadly attack on American forces linked directly to Tehran's command structure, a strike on a close U.S. partner that intelligence agencies attribute to Iranian planning, rather than a proxy acting independently. In each scenario, leaders in Washington would argue that inaction invites greater danger, while a controlled strike might restore deterrence. The initial operation would rely on standoff power. Stealth aircraft, cruise missiles, cyber tools, and electronic warfare would aim to blind air defenses and disable key facilities within hours. Targets would likely focus on missile storage sites, drone production hubs, command nodes of the Revolutionary Guard, and infrastructure linked to advanced weapons programs. The design would be surgical on paper, Hit capabilities, not cities. Avoid civilian concentrations. Keep the strike window short. But once explosions occur on sovereign territory, interpretation changes everything. Iranian leadership would face immediate pressure to respond. Not responding risks appearing weak at home and vulnerable abroad. Overreacting risks overwhelming retaliation. The choice would be to retaliate in a way that demonstrates resolve while avoiding a response that justifies a massive U.S. follow-on campaign. Iran's doctrine favors layered response. Within hours, regional partners and allied armed groups would likely receive signals to prepare actions. Rocket and drone attacks could target U.S. installations in Iraq or Syria. Cyber units might attempt to disrupt financial networks, energy systems, or communications tied to U.S. or allied infrastructure. Maritime harassment in the Gulf could increase, with fast boats, mines, or anti-ship missiles raising the risk to commercial shipping. At the same time, Tehran would use messaging as a weapon. State media would frame the strike as proof of American aggression, rallying domestic unity. Diplomatic channels with Russia, China, and non-aligned states would activate, seeking condemnation of the attack and calls for restraint that shift political pressure back onto Washington. International opinion becomes another battlefield. Washington, anticipating retaliation, would elevate force protection across the region. Missile defense batteries, naval escorts, and air patrols would move to high readiness. Rules of engagement might widen, allowing quicker responses to perceived threats. This defensive posture, while intended to prevent casualties, also shortens decision timelines. When forces are on edge, the chance of misreading intent rises. Israel's calculus would also shift rapidly. If intelligence indicates Iranian partners preparing large-scale strikes, Israeli leaders may choose preemptive action against supply routes, weapons depots, or leadership targets in neighboring territories. Such moves, even if not coordinated with Washington, would be seen by Tehran as part of the same confrontation, broadening the scope beyond a bilateral clash. Energy markets would react almost instantly. Even without physical damage to oil fields or shipping lanes, the risk premium alone could send prices upward. Insurance for vessels transiting the Gulf would rise. Governments dependent on imported energy would press for de-escalation, not necessarily out of alignment with either side, but from fear of economic fallout. Inside Iran, the strike could alter internal politics. Hardline factions arguing that compromise with the West is futile would gain ground. Security services would tighten control, citing national defense. Reform-minded voices calling for engagement might be sidelined, at least temporarily, as public attention shifts to sovereignty and resistance. External pressure often reshapes domestic balances in ways outside actors do not intend. Inside the United States, leaders would present the action as limited and necessary, yet public debate would surface quickly. What if retaliation grows? What if Americans are killed in follow-on attacks? What is the endpoint? Military planners can map targets, but they cannot fully map political endurance. Sustained exchange, even at low intensity, carries costs in readiness, budgets, and attention diverted from other global priorities. The most dangerous period would be the first several days, when neither side is sure how far the other will go. Each response invites another calculation. If militia attacks cause casualties, pressure mounts in Washington to strike more deeply. If U.S. defenses intercept most retaliation, Tehran might seek a more dramatic move to prove capability. Every step risks crossing an unseen threshold. Communication channels, even indirect ones, become critical. Messages passed through intermediaries can signal limits. Which targets are off limits? What actions would trigger major escalation? Whether both sides seek a way to pause. History shows that crises sometimes stabilize not because trust exists, but because both parties understand the cost of losing control. Yet understanding does not guarantee restraint. Technical failures, misidentification, or rogue actions by allied groups could derail careful signaling. A missile that lands in an unexpected place, a cyber attack that spreads beyond its intended target, or a local commander acting aggressively can transform a contained strike into a wider conflict before national leaders can recalibrate. Thus, the first phase after a U.S. strike would not be defined only by firepower, but by speed of decisions under uncertainty. The operation intended as a sharp warning could instead open a cycle where each move is justified as defensive, each response framed as proportional, and the overall trajectory drifts toward a broader confrontation neither side originally set as its goal. Once direct blows have been exchanged, the conflict stops being a two-actor problem. The Middle East is tightly connected through alliances, rivalries, sectarian ties, trade routes, and shared security fears. Pressure applied in one location radiates outward, forcing governments and armed groups to choose positions, sometimes faster than they would prefer. Lebanon becomes one of the first pressure points. Hezbollah is not just a militia. It is a political and military force embedded in the country's structure. If Iran signals that the confrontation is existential, Hezbollah faces a strategic choice: remain restrained to preserve Lebanon's fragile stability, or open a front against Israel to relieve pressure on Tehran. Even limited exchanges across the border can escalate quickly because both sides possess significant missile and airstrike capabilities. Civilian areas sit close to military targets, and each round of fire raises the political cost of backing down. Syria, already fractured by years of war, offers another arena. Iranian advisors, logistics hubs, and allied fighters operate there alongside Syrian government forces. Israel has repeatedly shown it will strike targets it sees as threats on Syrian soil. In a wider crisis, the pace and depth of these strikes could increase. Russia, also present in Syria, would seek to avoid direct entanglement, but would have to manage airspace deconfliction carefully to prevent accidental clashes. Multiple militaries operating in close proximity increases the margin for error. Iraq sits in an especially delicate position. It hosts U.S. personnel while also containing powerful armed groups with close ties to Iran. The Iraqi government, often balancing between these forces, could find itself unable to restrain militia actions or to protect foreign troops from retaliation. Each attack on bases or convoys risks U.S. counterstrikes on Iraqi territory, which in turn fuels domestic anger and political instability. A country still recovering from earlier wars could again become a central battleground for outside competition. In the Gulf states, the threat picture centers on infrastructure and shipping. Energy facilities, desalination plants, ports, and financial centers are critical not only to local economies, but to global markets. Missiles or drones do not have to cause catastrophic damage to have strategic effect. Even temporary disruption can shake investor confidence and strain government budgets. These states rely on U.S. security partnerships, but also fear becoming direct targets because of that association. Their diplomacy would focus on pushing for rapid de-escalation while strengthening defenses. Yemen adds another layer. Armed groups there have demonstrated the ability to strike across borders with missiles and drones. In a broader confrontation, attacks linked to the Iran-aligned camp could target regional shipping routes or energy sites. complicating efforts to keep maritime trade flowing. Naval forces from multiple countries might expand patrols, increasing the density of armed vessels in confined waterways. Turkey, positioned between Europe and the Middle East, would calculate carefully. As a NATO member with its own regional ambitions, it would seek to avoid being drawn directly into U.S.-Iran hostilities while protecting its borders and influence in neighboring states. Refugee flows, trade disruptions, and security vacuums in nearby countries would affect its decisions as much as alliance politics. Beyond the region, global powers would respond through diplomacy, economics, and positioning rather than direct military entry. China, heavily dependent on energy imports from the Gulf, would press for stability and could attempt to present itself as a mediator. Russia might see opportunity in higher energy prices and in a U.S. focus diverted from other theaters, while still avoiding steps that trigger open confrontation with Washington. European states, vulnerable to energy shocks and migration pressures, would prioritize ceasefire efforts and humanitarian concerns. Financial markets would transmit the shock worldwide. Energy price volatility feeds into transportation costs, inflation, and political tensions in countries far removed from the battlefield. Insurance rates for shipping through key waterways would rise. Companies might reroute trade, slowing supply chains. The conflict's economic footprint could outlast the military exchange itself. Information space becomes another front. Each side would push narratives framing itself as defensive and the other as reckless. Images of damage, civilian suffering, or intercepted missiles would circulate rapidly, shaping public opinion and diplomatic pressure. Cyber operations could target media, government systems, and private infrastructure, blurring lines between military and civilian domains. The risk in this phase is not only deliberate escalation, but cumulative strain. Multiple limited confrontations can interact in unpredictable ways. An airstrike in one country triggers retaliation in another. A maritime incident leads to broader naval engagement. Leaders juggling several hotspots may find it harder to control the overall trajectory, especially when domestic audiences demand firmness. Humanitarian consequences would grow as fighting spreads. Displacement from border regions, damage to power grids and water systems, and disruption of medical services could create secondary crises. Aid organizations often struggle to operate in contested environments, and sanctions or security restrictions can complicate relief efforts. All actors would weigh not only military success, but endurance. Sustained instability drains budgets, stresses armed forces, and diverts attention from internal priorities. Even states not directly fighting would face economic and political pressure from prolonged disruption. The longer the confrontation persists, the more it reshapes regional alignments, potentially pushing rivals into temporary cooperation or driving neutral states to take clearer sides. What began as a targeted strike thus evolves into a system-wide test. Every government calculates risk versus survival, alliance versus autonomy, short-term gain versus long-term cost. In such an environment, controlling escalation becomes less about issuing threats and more about managing a web of reactions that no single capital fully commands. If the confrontation persists beyond initial exchanges and regional spillover, the consequences begin to move from immediate military concerns to long-term structural change. Wars between major regional actors rarely end where planners expect. Even limited campaigns can alter alliances, economies, and strategic doctrines for years. One of the first shifts would be in global energy politics. Prolonged instability around the Gulf, even without continuous fighting, raises risk premiums that reshape investment decisions. Countries dependent on imported fuel accelerate diversification, strategic reserves become central to national planning, and energy exporters outside the conflict zone gain leverage. Market volatility feeds domestic political debates worldwide, linking distant households to decisions made in military command centers thousands of miles away. Military postures would also evolve. The United States might reinforce regional bases, expand missile defense coverage, and deepen integration with partner militaries. Iran, facing direct vulnerability, would likely double down on dispersal of assets, harden facilities, and reliance on indirect methods of influence. Both sides would study the conflict's lessons, what systems proved survivable, which tactics failed, how cyber and electronic warfare shaped outcomes, and adapt for future confrontations. The result is not demilitarization, but a more technologically and geographically complex competition. Political landscapes inside the main actors would change as well. External pressure often strengthens security institutions and weakens advocates of compromise. Narratives of resistance and sovereignty gain traction when a country feels under threat. In the United States, extended involvement abroad can intensify debates over priorities, alliances, and the balance between deterrence and restraint. Elections, budget negotiations, and public opinion become part of the strategic environment. Diplomacy does not disappear in war, it operates in parallel. Back-channel talks, mediated messages, and incremental confidence-building steps can emerge even while clashes continue. Prisoner exchanges, maritime safety arrangements, or tacit limits on certain categories of targets sometimes serve as early signs of de-escalation. These measures rarely resolve core disputes but can slow the pace of violence and open space for broader negotiations later. International institutions and coalitions would attempt to shape outcomes, though their influence depends on unity among major powers. Calls for ceasefires, monitoring missions, or sanctions adjustments become tools in the diplomatic toolkit. Yet competing interests among global players often limit the effectiveness of collective action. Some states prioritize stability at almost any cost. Others weigh strategic advantage more heavily. A prolonged crisis also affects non-state actors. Armed groups that gain experience, equipment, or legitimacy during conflict may become more entrenched in local politics afterward. Disarmament and reintegration become harder. Borders grow more porous as weapons circulate. Even if frontline fighting subsides, the legacy of militarization can persist in the form of sporadic violence and weakened state authority in certain areas. Technological thresholds might shift. The use of advanced drones, precision missiles, cyber capabilities, and space-based assets in a real conflict provides data that peacetime exercises cannot. Other states observe and incorporate lessons into their own planning. The conflict thus influences military thinking far beyond the original participants. Economic reconstruction and recovery would be uneven. Areas directly affected by strikes or disruptions need infrastructure repair and financial support. Sanctions regimes, if tightened during the conflict, can complicate rebuilding even after hostilities decrease. Businesses weigh political risk more heavily when considering investment, slowing growth in already fragile economies. There is also the question of precedent. If direct strikes between long adversarial states become normalized, thresholds for future use of force may lower. Conversely, if the cost proves severe and widely felt, leaders elsewhere might see cautionary lessons about escalation. Which interpretation prevails depends on how the confrontation unfolds and how it ends. Ending is itself complex. Conflicts of this type often conclude not with formal treaties but with gradual reduction in intensity. Communication channels reopen, red lines become clearer, and both sides quietly accept a new status quo. The absence of resolution on underlying disputes means tension can rebuild over time, but immediate pressures ease. The broader strategic picture could shift toward a more multipolar mediation environment. States not directly involved may gain diplomatic stature by facilitating dialogue or economic support. Regional organizations might seek greater roles in security arrangements, though their capacity varies. The architecture that emerges reflects both power realities and the shared desire to avoid repeating the crisis. Human impact remains central. Families displaced, infrastructure damaged, and trust eroded create long-term social effects. Education, healthcare, and employment disruptions influence a generation's prospects. These factors, though less visible than military maneuvers, shape political stability and attitudes toward future engagement or confrontation. Ultimately, the significance of such a conflict lies not only in battlefield outcomes, but in how it recalibrates risk perceptions. Leaders who experience near escalation may invest more in crisis management mechanisms. Alternatively, hardened views may deepen divides. The direction is not predetermined. What is clear is that once direct force is used between entrenched rivals, the timeline stretches. Decisions made in days echo for decades. Military planners, diplomats, economists, and citizens all operate in the shadow of that moment, adjusting expectations and strategies to a world where a line once considered too dangerous to cross has already been crossed.